stay silent. The words are not a request. They're surviving. A hand clamps over Dreistan Ravenholt's mouth as he steps across the threshold of his own palace, expecting torchlight and ceremony, receiving only darkness and the iron grip of a terrified servant. Melis's crown drags him backward into a linen closet, her heartbeat wild beneath his fingers. He is immortal, feared, crowned by 4 centuries of blood, yet in this moment, he obeys. Through the slatted door, voices drift closer. Seraphine's laughter, smooth as poured wine, intimate in a way it never was in their chambers. Alaric's eager murmurs, young and hungry. Dreistan hears his own name spoken with clinical precision, as if discussing livestock rather than a sovereign. He's still standing, Alaric mutters, frustration sharpening his tone. Seraphine's reply is cold silk. I've already doubled the dose in the ritual wine. By the new moon, he won't have the strength to question anything. Before we dive deeper into Dristan's fight for survival, I need to know, are you Team Melis or Team Seraphine? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if you're already feeling the tension, smash that like button because this story is about to get darker. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when Dreistan discovers just how deep the betrayal goes. Now let's continue. In that instant, every dizzy spell, every wave of weakness Dreistan had attributed to age snapped into brutal focus. It wasn't the weight of centuries. It was poison, served with a kiss at his own table during rites meant to honor Valar's bloodline. His queen's hands had offered him death disguised as devotion. Melis didn't wait for him to process the betrayal. The moment the voices faded, she pulled him deeper into the palace's forgotten arteries, servant tunnels he'd never known existed, passages that smelled of dust and decades-old secrets. When Dreistan reached instinctively for a sigil ring to summon the night guard, she caught his wrist with surprising strength. Don't, she hissed, eyes burning in the dim light. Your guard captain answers to your brother now. Calling him is signing your own execution order. The words hit harder than any blade. Dreistan stared at the ring on his finger, the symbol that had opened every door, commanded every oath, and realized it had become a beacon for his hunters. Melis stripped him of everything traceable. The sigil ring clattered into a drainage grate. His ceremonial cloak, embroidered with Ravenholt crests, was stuffed behind a rotting beam. The relic blade passed down through 12 generations was wrapped in kitchen rags like common cutlery. Each item removed felt like a layer of identity peeling away, leaving only flesh and fear. They slipped beyond the palace walls just as alarm bells began to toll, a false alert about an intruder, Dreistan realized with sick certainty. They were already rewriting his absence into a narrative of madness or abandonment. Melis led him through districts he'd never walked, past common folk who didn't recognize their king without his crown. Her small room in the servants' quarter of Hollowcrown Lane felt impossibly fragile, thin walls, a single candle, the scent of bread and desperation. Yet it was the only sanctuary left to him. Dreistan collapsed onto a narrow cot, his body betraying him as the poison continued its slow work. The fever climbed his spine, like fingers. His vision blurred at the edges. Every time his eyes closed, he heard Seraphine's voice. By the new moon, he won't have the strength to question anything. Melis pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her touch steady despite the tremor in her hands. Stay with me, your majesty, she murmured. Don't let them win. Her voice carried no pity, only the resolve of someone who'd learned that survival isn't granted. It's fought for in the margins of power, where people like her had always lived. Dreistan tried to speak, but his throat burned. All he managed was a rasped whisper. Why? Why risk everything for a king who'd never noticed her existence until she became his only lifeline? Melis's hand didn't falter. Because I saw the truth, she said, eyes shining fierce in the candlelight. And because no one deserves to die in their own home while monsters call it loyalty. Outside, the sounds of ordinary life continued. Vendors calling, children laughing, the world turning as if a kingdom wasn't collapsing behind palace walls. Inside, Drystan swallowed the terror that his authority could no longer protect him. He wasn't just recovering from poison. He was waking to a reality where the crown had become a target, and the only person standing between him and the grave was a woman he'd been too blind to see. By the third night, the fever eased, but the horror sharpened. Drystan sat upright, fingers trembling around a chipped clay cup, nothing like the jeweled goblets he was accustomed to. And for the first time, he wasn't fighting sleep. He was fighting memory. The past weeks replayed like a condemned man's final vision. The sudden vertigo during council sessions. The way his hand shook signing documents while Seraphine's voice stayed honey-sweet and concerned. "You're carrying too much, my love. Let Alaric share the burden." He believed her because it was easier than admitting the impossible. Now every symptom aligned with cruel precision. Not age, not weakness, a calculated execution disguised as devotion. His stomach twisted as he remembered the ritual wine ceremonies. Seraphine placing the chalice in his hands like a sacred offering, her lips brushing his cheek as if blessing him. How many times had he thanked her? How many times had he drunk deeply, performing kingship while consuming his own undoing? Melis watched from the doorway, silent but present, as if her steadiness alone could keep him from fracturing. "I let them stand beside me," Drystan whispered, voice breaking on the admission. "I built my throne on people who were measuring it for my brother." Melis stepped forward and placed her palm against his shoulder, firm, anchoring. "You didn't let anything happen," she said. "You trusted. That's not a crime. But staying blind now would be." Drystan swallowed hard, his eyes burning with something that felt like grief's sharper cousin. He looked at Melis, truly looked, and something inside him shifted from shock to purpose. "Then I'm done being the king who doesn't see," he said, rising on unsteady legs. "If they wanted me weak, they chose the wrong ending." And in the quiet of that small, humble room, Drystan understood. Surviving the poison was only the beginning. The real fight was reclaiming his kingdom from the people who tried to bury him with a smile, and learning what kind of ruler could emerge from the ashes of blind sovereignty. But before Drystan Ravenholt became the king who fled through servant passages, before Melis' crown became his unlikely savior, there was a palace built on centuries of blood, a covenant spoken in darkness, and a queen whose smile had always hidden teeth. Dristan's resolve lasted exactly as long as it took for footsteps to echo in the corridor outside. Melis moved before he could react, snuffing the candle with her bare fingers and pulling him toward a section of wall that looked no different from any other. Her hands found a seam invisible in the darkness, and the panel gave way with a whisper of ancient hinges. "Now," she breathed, and they slipped into a passage so narrow Dristan's shoulders scraped stone on both sides. The tunnels smelled of neglect and something older, blood memory soaked into mortar, the residue of servants who'd learned to move unseen through a palace that devoured the visible. Melis navigated without hesitation, her fingers trailing along walls marked with symbols Drystan had never learned to read. Servant language, the invisible architecture of his own kingdom. Behind them, voices filtered through the walls. Alaric's tenor, sharp with irritation. "Search every room. He can't have gone far in his condition." Dristan's pride ignited despite his weakness. He was still sovereign, still commanded the night guard, an order forged in blood oaths that transcended politics. His hand moved to his chest, reaching for the sigil that should have been there, the one Melis had forced him to discard. "I need to summon Captain Veyron," he whispered. "The guard answers only to Ravenholt blood. They'll kill you." Melis cut him off, pulling him down a side passage as torchlight flickered somewhere behind them. "Your Majesty, please. You have to trust me." But trust was a luxury Drystan no longer possessed. The moment they reached a wider chamber, some forgotten storage room filled with rotting tapestries, he pressed his palm flat against the stone wall and spoke the summoning words, the ancient call that should have resonated through every sworn blade in the palace. Nothing. He tried again, pouring what remained of his strength into the invocation. The words that had never failed him, that had brought his guard running through fire and siege. Silence answered. Dead, empty silence. They changed the oaths, Melis said quietly. She wasn't gloating. She sounded grieved. 3 weeks ago, your brother called an emergency res-wearing ceremony while you were in your chambers. Said it was to strengthen defenses after the southern treaties failed. You weren't there to hear what words they actually spoke. The truth settled over Dry Stan like a burial shroud. His guard, his blood-sworn protectors, had been rebound while he slept, while poison clouded his judgment. The oaths no longer recognized him as their anchor. Alaric had already taken his place in the architecture of power. How long have you known? Dry Stan asked, his voice hollow. I was there, Melis said, carrying wine for the ceremony. I watched them remake your kingdom while you suffered upstairs, and her voice caught. I couldn't warn you. Who would believe a maid? Before Dry Stan could respond, his body betrayed him. Hunger tore through his gut with vicious intensity, not the ordinary hunger of mortals, but the deeper need that defined his kind. His vision tunneled. His fangs ached against his gums. The poison was disrupting more than his strength. It was severing his connection to the blood that sustained him. He staggered, catching himself against the wall. I know, Melis said, and the fear finally showed in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. But you can't feed here. Every servant in the palace has been questioned. They're watching for signs of you. I'm not asking permission, Dry Stan growled, the words coming out more feral than he intended. Melis stepped closer instead of away. Then you'll die, she said flatly. Because the moment you lose control, the moment you're seen, they'll have proof you've gone mad. Is that how you want this to end? Hunted down like a rabid animal while your brother takes everything you built. The words cut through his hunger with brutal clarity. She was right. Even his body was no longer his own weapon. It was a liability, evidence waiting to be used against him. This isn't the first time, Melis continued, her voice dropping. I've watched nobles disappear before. Ones who asked too many questions, who noticed things they shouldn't. The palace has ways of erasing people. You've been erased, Your Majesty. You just didn't know it yet. The emotional fracture came quietly, without warning. Dry Stan had spent centuries believing the crown protected him, that his power radiated outward as shield and authority. But the truth was uglier. The crown had protected everyone around him, elevated them, secured them, while leaving him exposed at the center. The higher the throne, the farther the fall. And no one had bothered to catch him. Your Majesty. Melis's urgent whisper snapped him back. They're coming. Torchlight bloomed in the passage they'd abandoned. Voices grew louder, coordinated. Seraphine's guards, moving with the efficiency of a hunt rather than a search. Melis pulled him deeper into the tunnels, through chambers that felt like the palace's buried memory. Dristan's ceremonial coat, still bearing the Raven Holt crest, snagged on a broken beam. Without ceremony, Melis tore it free and shoved it behind a pile of debris. The cloak too, she insisted. No. The word came out strangled. The cloak had been worn by his father, his grandfather. It was woven with threads of silver that marked him as direct descendant of Valor himself. They're tracking you by sight, Melis said, already reaching for the clasp. Every symbol makes you visible. Every mark of power makes you prey. Her fingers worked the fastening before he could stop her. The cloak fell away, pooling on the stone like shed skin. Then the rings, one for each century of rule, each a relic of conquest or treaty. They clinked into the darkness of a drainage channel, irretrievable. Dry Stan stood in his simple undertunic, stripped of every marker that had defined him. He looked like any other man, pale, weakened, anonymous. He looked like he could disappear. This way, Melis breathed and led him toward a section of wall that opened onto the night air beyond the palace grounds. They emerged in the shadow of the eastern wall, where refuse was collected and the city began its sprawl into ordinary life. Drystan could see the palace behind them, his home, his kingdom, lit from within like a jeweled trap. Somewhere inside, Alaric was already wearing authority like borrowed armor. Seraphine was already rewriting the narrative of his absence. The crown was already being measured for a new head. The king had become prey. And the only way to survive was to learn to move like something hunted. The city beyond the palace walls was a foreign country. Melis guided Drystan through streets he'd only ever seen from parapets and balconies, distant, decorative, irrelevant. Up close, they smelled of smoke and cooking fat, unwashed bodies and industry. People moved past without recognition, their eyes sliding over him as if he were made of the same shadows they navigated daily. It should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like drowning. They ducked into an alley where refuse gathered in corners, and Melis finally stopped. Her hand shot out, palm up. The rest. Now. Dristan's fingers moved instinctively to his left hand, to the last ring he wore. Not ceremonial gold, but blackened silver etched with Valar's sigil. His father had placed it on his finger the night he ascended. It had never left his hand in 4 centuries. No, he said, the word barely audible. It's enchanted, Melis pressed. Bloodbound. They can track it across the kingdom. Your Majesty, please. I said no. His voice carried an edge of the authority he no longer possessed. This is all I have left. Melis's expression shifted, not to deference, but to something harder. Then it will be all you have left when they find your corpse. The bluntness of it shocked him. She reached for his hand, and he pulled back, but she was faster, more desperate. Her fingers closed around his wrist with surprising strength. You think these symbols protect you, she said, voice low and fierce. But they're screaming your location to everyone who wants you dead. The ring, the blade, even the way you stand, it all marks you. And marks get people killed. Drystan stared at her, this woman who'd been invisible to him for years, now the only thing between him and oblivion. Slowly, painfully, he twisted the ring free. It resisted, clinging to his finger as if the metal itself refused to let go. When it finally came loose, Melis didn't hesitate. She dropped it into a nearby grate, where it disappeared into the city's sewage with a distant splash. Drystan felt the absence, like an amputation. They moved deeper into the common districts, past taverns spilling laughter and workshops still lit despite the late hour. Drystan had approved trade policies for these streets, signed charters that governed their commerce, but he'd never walked among the people who lived by those distant decisions. Now he saw the cracked cobblestones his decrees had never repaired, the children whose hunger his abundance had never touched. The blood hunger hit him without warning. One moment he was walking. The next, his vision narrowed to the pulse beating in a woman's throat as she passed. His fangs extended involuntarily. His body moved before his mind caught up, drawn by instinct older than civilization. He caught himself against a wall, breathing hard, horrified by how close he'd come. The poison had destabilized everything. His control, his restraint, the careful balance that separated him from the monsters of legend. Your Majesty. Melis's voice cut through the red haze. She was beside him, her own pulse visible at her neck, steady and unafraid. You need to feed. Not like this, Drystan managed. Not, I can't. But his body disagreed. The hunger clawed upward from his gut, primitive and demanding. He'd always fed with ceremony, with consent carefully negotiated through ritual. Blood offered, not taken. Now that structure was gone and he was reduced to base need. He lunged without meaning to. Melis caught his face between her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Look at me, she commanded. Not the blood. Me. Her fearlessness shocked him back to something like sanity. She should have been terrified. He was stronger, faster, monstrous in his hunger. But she held his gaze without flinching. You're not a monster, she said quietly. You're sick and starving. There's a difference. The words shouldn't have mattered, but they did. Dristan's breathing slowed. His fangs retracted gradually, painfully. Melis produced a small vial from her pocket, something dark and preserved, likely stolen from palace stores. "It's not fresh," she warned, "but it will take the edge off." Drystan drank it like medicine, tasting ash and humiliation. This was what he'd become, a king taking charity from a maid in an alley, sustaining himself on scraps. As they moved on, whispers began to filter through the streets. A drunken merchant at a tavern door, laughing at the scandal. A night watchman telling his companion the news. The kings fled the palace. Gone mad, they say. Ravenholt's run off, abandoned the crown. They're saying he tried to kill the queen. The lies spread like plague, faster than truth ever could. Drystan listened to his legacy being rewritten in real time, his authority dissolving into rumor and ridicule. Melis pulled him into the shadow of an abandoned building as a patrol passed, palace guards wearing Alaric's colors now, hunting their former sovereign. "You're alive," Melis whispered, as if reading his thoughts. "That's what matters." But Drystan understood the cruel arithmetic of survival. He was breathing, yes. His heart still beats with borrowed blood. But the king, the sovereign, the authority, the 4 centuries of accumulated power, that man had been erased as efficiently as his name from the guard oaths. Drystan Ravenholt was alive. But he was no longer sovereign of anything except his own diminishing mortality. Hold on, can we just talk about how Drystan went from a mortal king to hunted prey in 3 days? If you're as shocked as I am, hit that like button right now. And here's a question for the comments. Would you have trusted Melis? Or would you have called Captain Reed anyway? Because what's coming next at Hollow Crown Lane is going to change everything. Drystan thinks he's lost it all, but he's about to discover secrets that have been buried for 300 years. Stay with me. Hollow Crown Lane existed in the space where the city forgot itself. Even in darkness, Drystan could feel the wrongness of it. The way foot traffic diverted without conscious thought, how conversation died as people passed the narrow entrance. The lane bent away from the main road like a broken finger, lined with buildings that leaned inward as if sharing secrets with the dead. "Why here?" Drystan asked, his voice rough from exhaustion and preserved blood. Melis didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the house at the lane's end, her expression caught between fear and recognition. "Because no one comes here. Not palace guards. Not city watch. Not anyone who values their sanity." The house stood 3 stories tall, its windows dark as cataracts. Vines had claimed the walls, but they grew in patterns too deliberate to be natural, spiraling around frames and lintels like written script. The door hung slightly ajar, as if breathing. "This place has a name in servant stories," Melis continued quietly. "Valar's Hollow, where the first king's heart was shattered." Drystan felt something cold slide down his spine. He'd heard fragments of the story, sanitized versions told in council chambers, stripped of their horror. Valar, the progenitor of his bloodline, had died here. Not in battle or ceremony, but in betrayal so profound it had fractured something fundamental in the world. "The histories say he died in the palace," Drystan protested weakly. "The histories lie." Melis pushed the door open. It moved silently despite its apparent decay. "The older servants know. We pass the stories down because someone has to remember what gets erased." Inside, the air tasted of copper and time. Dust hung suspended in shafts of moonlight that penetrated gaps in the roof. But beneath the decay, Drystan could see the bones of something grander. Walls that had once been painted with murals, now faded to ghosts. Floors inlaid with symbols that still gleamed faintly despite centuries of neglect. Sigils. Hundreds of them. Some he recognized from his own palace, but others were older, written in a dialect of power he'd never learned. Melis moved through the space with careful reverence, her fingers hovering over markings without quite touching them. "The old servants taught me to read these," she murmured. "Not the words themselves, but their purpose. These are words. Protection spells. Something was being hidden here." Drystan felt it then, a resonance in his chest, deeper than heartbeat. The blood memory Melis had mentioned in the tunnels, but stronger here, insistent. As if something in this house recognized him. Or recognized what he carried inside him, the last living fragment of Vaylor's lineage. They found her in what had once been a study. Saren Finch lay on a makeshift pallet, surrounded by a circle of wardstones that still pulsed with faint light. She was unconscious but breathing, her dark hair spread around her like spilled ink. She looked ordinary, no crown, no jewelry, no markers of significance. Yet the wards protecting her were more complex than anything guarding the royal vaults. "Who is she?" Drystan whispered. Melis knelt beside the woman, her hands moving over the wardstones with newfound confidence. "I don't know, but someone powerful wanted her protected. These wards," she traced a symbol in the air, not quite touching it. "They're keyed to Ravenholt blood. Old Ravenholt. Before the crown corrupted everything." The words stung, but Drystan couldn't deny their truth. He moved closer, and the wards reacted to his presence, brightening slightly. The resonance in his chest intensified until it became painful, a recognition that went beyond memory into something cellular. "It's Vaylor's heart," he breathed, understanding blooming with sick certainty. "Or what's left of it. The ward is made from his final magic." As if responding to his words, Saren's eyes fluttered open. They were dark and ancient, holding awareness that didn't match her seemingly young face. Her gaze found Drystan immediately, focusing with the precision of someone who'd been waiting. "Ravenholt," she whispered, her voice like wind through ruins. "Finally. I thought I'd die before one of you came." "Who are you?" Drystan asked, kneeling despite his weakness. Saren's hand moved weakly, gesturing at the walls around them. "Witness. Guardian. The last one who remembers what Vaylor actually said before they silenced him." Her breathing grew labored. "Your queen, Seraphine. Her bloodline was never meant to rule. The marriage was a mistake, a corruption of the covenant." "What covenant?" Melis pressed. But Saren's eyes were already closing again, consciousness slipping away. Her final words came out barely audible. "The poison, it's not just murder. It's severe, breaking the last thread between Ravenholt blood and Vaylor's promise. When you die, Drystan, everything ends." Her hand fell limp. The wards around her pulsed once, then settled back into their patient vigil. Drystan sat back on his heels, mind reeling. Everything he'd believed about his lineage, about the careful architecture of his rule, was built on corrupted foundations. Seraphine hadn't just married him for power. She'd married him to destroy something older than the throne itself. "Your Majesty." Melis's voice was tight with fresh fear. She was at the window, peering through gaps in the vines. Torches. Coming up the lane. Drystan joined her, his body protesting every movement. Through the greenery, he could see them. Palace guards in full armor, moving with purpose rather than patrol. They knew where to look. Somehow, despite the wards and the city's collective avoidance, they'd been led here. "They're not searching," Melis said quietly. "They're hunting." The past Drystan had been running from had just caught up. And it brought weapons. Outside, a voice called out, "Alarix, carrying false concern and real threat. Brother, we know you're here. Come out, and we can discuss this peacefully. You're unwell. You need help." Drystan looked at Saren's unconscious form, at the wards that had kept her safe for untold years, at Melis beside him. This woman who'd saved him repeatedly with nothing but courage and forbidden knowledge. The past refused to stay buried. But perhaps, Drystan thought as torchlight crept closer, that was the point. Perhaps some truths needed to be dragged into the light, no matter how many crowns they shattered in the process. The hunters had arrived. But they weren't the only ones who knew how to draw blood. The hunters circled the house like wolves testing prey, but they didn't enter. The wards held them at bay, ancient magic that even Alaric's corrupted authority couldn't penetrate. Yet, they're waiting for dawn, Melis whispered, watching shadows move beyond the windows. Words like these weaken with sunlight. Old magic feeds on darkness. Drystan turned back to Saren, still unconscious within her protective circle. They had hours at most. Hours to understand centuries of lies before the truth died with them in this forgotten house. As if hearing his desperation, Saren's eyes opened fully. This time, consciousness stayed. She sat up slowly, her gaze clear and devastatingly sad as it settled on Drystan. "You look like him," she said softly. "Valor. Same eyes. Same pride set to your shoulders, even now when you've lost everything." She paused. "Especially now." "Who are you?" Drystan asked again, kneeling at the edge of her wards. "Saren Finch, Keeper of the Covenant, Guardian of Valor's final testimony." She touched one of the wardstones, and it pulsed with golden light. "I've been waiting 300 years for a Ravenholt to come here not as conqueror, but as supplicant." Melis moved closer, her earlier fear replaced by hungry attention. "The covenant the servants speak of, the one that was broken?" Saren nodded, her expression ancient despite her unwrinkled face. "Valor didn't build his kingdom on conquest alone. He made a pact with the old families, the bloodlines that held this land before vampires claimed it. A promise, immortal protection in exchange for willing service. Not slavery. Partnership." "I know this," Drystan interjected. "The founding oaths are fiction," Saren cut him off gently. "Rewritten 3 generations after Valor's death. The true covenant was more binding, more sacred. It required the ruling Ravenholt to marry from the servant lines, to keep power tethered to the people it governed, to remember that crowns serve those beneath them." The words landed like physical blows. Drystan thought of Seraphine, noble-born, descended from the southern territories, her lineage impeccable by every official measure. Their marriage had been politically brilliant, uniting fractured regions under one rule. Seraphine, he breathed. She wasn't. She was never meant to stand beside a Ravenholt king, Saren confirmed. Her bloodlines sought power, not partnership. When your father broke the covenant and married her mother to his brother, consolidating noble alliances instead of honoring the old pact, he severed something fundamental. The magic that bound Ravenholt rule to the people's consent began to fray. Then Dristan's voice cracked. My entire reign, built on a foundation already crumbling, Saren said, not unkindly. You inherited the sin, Drystan. You didn't create it, but you perpetuated it by marrying Seraphine, by trusting her, by never questioning why the old families grew silent while the nobles grew loud. Melis had gone very still. The servant lines, she said slowly. The covenant servants. Your bloodline, Saren finished. Crown is one of the oldest names. Your ancestors stood beside Valor when he made his promise. They were witnesses, partners, the conscience of the crown. She turned to Drystan. This woman who saved you isn't just a maid. She's what you should have married. What every Ravenholt should have chosen to keep the covenant alive. The revelation hung in the dusty air like smoke. Drystan looked at Melis, really looked, and saw not just the woman who'd pulled him from death, but the embodiment of everything his line had betrayed. The partnership they'd reduced to servitude. The equals they'd demoted to invisibility. The poison, Drystan said, pieces falling into horrible alignment. It's not just about killing me. It's about severing the last thread, Saren confirmed. Your blood still carries Valor's covenant, diluted but present. When you die without an heir, without honoring the old promise, the magic ends completely. Seraphine's line will rule unopposed, unchecked by the ancient bindings. The kingdom will belong entirely to those who see power as dominion rather than duty. Outside, Alaric's voice called again. We can wait all night, brother. You're only delaying the inevitable. Dristan's hands clenched. I could hide. We could run farther, find somewhere beyond their reach, and let the covenant die in silence. Saren's voice carried unexpected steel. Let Seraphine's corruption become the only truth anyone remembers? You'd live, Drystan. But everything Valor built, everything your people deserve, would be buried with a lie. He's one man, Melis protested. Poisoned, hunted, stripped of authority. How is he supposed to? Not alone, Saren interrupted. She reached for Melis's hand, pulling her into the ward circle. The magic accepted her immediately, recognizing her blood. The Covenant servants still exist, scattered and silenced. But they remember. They've been waiting for a sign that the old promise still matters. Saren began tracing symbols in the air, teaching Melis the gestures with urgent precision. These are ward release patterns. They'll unlock the protections I've hidden throughout the kingdom, testimonies sealed in stone, contracts written in blood, proof of what was promised and what was stolen. Melis's fingers followed the movements, clumsy at first, then finding their rhythm. If we release these words, we expose everything? Everything, Saren confirmed. The false lineages. The rewritten oaths. The covenant that should have governed centuries of rule. She looked at Drystan. But it will also make you a bigger target. The moment this truth spreads, they'll hunt you with everything they have. Not just to silence you, to erase the possibility that things could be different. Drystan felt the weight of the choice settling over him, like a physical burden. He could run, preserving his life at the cost of his legacy. Or he could fight, risk everything to expose a truth that might change nothing except the manner of his death. He thought of Melis, invisible for years until desperation gave her courage. Of Saren, waiting centuries in this tomb of a house for someone to care enough to listen. Of all the people he'd never seen, never valued, because the crown had taught him to look upward at nobles rather than downward at the foundation that held everything together. When, he asked quietly. Saren smiled, sad and proud. Alaric's coronation. 3 days from now. He's already announced it, the grieving brother assuming the burden of rule after the Mad King's disappearance. 3 days, Melis repeated, looking at Dristan's weakened state. You can barely stand. How are we supposed to? By making truth our weapon, Drystan said, his voice finding strength he'd thought the poison had stolen. They want me erased. Instead, I'll be evidence. He met Saren's ancient eyes. Teach us everything. Every ward, every testimony, every piece of proof. If I'm going to die, it won't be in hiding. Saren nodded and began to teach them the language of old magic, the words that could unmake crowns and remake kingdoms if anyone had the courage to speak them. Outside, the hunters waited for dawn. Inside, the past armed itself for war. Truth, Drystan understood, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Especially the truth that powerful people had spent centuries trying to bury. Dawn broke over Hollowcrown Lane, and the hunters withdrew like shadows before light. But they didn't go far. Drystan could see them repositioning, forming a perimeter that turned the house from sanctuary into prison. They'll starve us out, he said, watching from behind rotting curtains. Wait until weakness makes us easy prey. Then we don't wait. Melis was practicing the ward release gestures Saren had taught her, her fingers moving through patterns that left faint traces of light in the air. We move during the coronation preparations, when the palace is chaos and ceremony. Drystan turned to her, fear tight in his chest. I can barely walk without trembling. How am I supposed to infiltrate the place that's hunting me? By remembering you built it, Saren said from her palate. Her voice had grown weaker through the night, as if teaching Melis the old magic had drained something essential. You know its rhythms, its blind spots. You designed half those ceremonial protocols yourself. That was when I was king. Dristan's words came out bitter. Now you're what Valor was at the end, Saren interrupted. A man facing the people who betrayed him, armed with nothing but truth. She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. The difference is, Valor faced them alone. You have witnesses. Melis moved to Saren's side, concerned about sharpening her features. You're getting worse. The wards are failing, Saren admitted. Maintaining them for 3 centuries took everything. Teaching you to release them, she smiled weakly. That was my last purpose. I'm ready to rest. Not yet, Drystan said, kneeling beside her. We need you. Your testimony is already written in the wardstones you'll release, Saren said gently. My voice will speak even after I'm silent. That's the magic of true covenant. It outlives the witnesses. The weight of her impending death settled over them. They had 2 days to learn centuries of hidden history, to plan an infiltration that would likely end in their executions, and to somehow expose a conspiracy that had already rewritten every official record. Why are you afraid? Melis asked Drystan that night, as they sat in the darkness listening to Saren's labored breathing. Not dying. I can see you've already accepted that. What else? Drystan was quiet for a long moment. That it won't matter, he finally admitted. That we'll expose everything, bleed for the truth, and the kingdom will choose the comfortable lie anyway. Power is easier than justice. Always has been. Then we make the truth impossible to ignore, Melis said with quiet ferocity. We don't just tell them, we show them. You, alive and poisoned. The wards, speaking Vaylor's actual words. The servants, finally seen. She met his eyes. Survival only matters if it leads somewhere. Otherwise, we're just prolonging the dying. Her words echoed through the following day as they planned. Saren, gathering her failing strength, drew maps in the dust, marking where she'd hidden wardstones throughout the palace over centuries of secret visits. Passages even Melis didn't know. Ritual chambers that predated the current structure. The coronation will take place in the Great Hall, Saren explained, her finger tracing symbols. But the real ceremony, the blood binding that transfers authority, happens in the Covenant Chamber beneath. That's where the original oaths were spoken, where the wardstones remember everything. I've never heard of a Covenant Chamber, Drystan said. Because it was sealed after they rewrote the oaths, Saren replied. Buried beneath new construction. But the magic remains, waiting for Ravenholt blood to wake it. They moved at twilight of the second day, slipping through the hunter's perimeter using tunnels Saren had kept secret even from the servants. The palace appeared before them like a beautiful predator, lit from within, decorated for celebration, completely unaware of the ghosts approaching its heart. Infiltrating during preparation chaos proved easier than Drystan expected. Servants rushed everywhere, nobles arrived in ceremonial dress, and guards focused outward, watching for a mad king fleeing rather than one walking deliberately into the trap. Hidden in servant corridors, Drystan witnessed his own erasure. New portraits already hung in the galleries, Alaric rendered in royal regalia, his features noble and strong. The caption read, Alaric Ravenholt, reluctant sovereign, protector of the realm in its hour of need. Dristan's own portrait had been removed, likely stored in some forgotten vault. They work fast, Melis murmured beside him. But it was watching his brother that truly broke something in Dristan's chest. Through a partially open door, he saw Alaric being fitted for the crown, his crown, while advisors fawned and reassured. Yet beneath Alaric's confident smile, Drystan recognized the tightness around his eyes. The way his hands trembled slightly when no one was watching. His brother was terrified. He doesn't want this, Drystan whispered. He's being used as much as I was. Doesn't make him innocent, Melis said. He still chose poison over honesty. They moved deeper into the palace, and Drystan saw the true architect of his downfall. Seraphine held court in what had been his private study, surrounded by council members who hung on her every word. She wore mourning black that somehow made her more radiant, her performance of grief so perfect it was obscene. The kingdom requires stability, she was saying, her voice carrying the authority he'd once believed was partnership. Alaric will provide what his brother could not, decisive leadership unclouded by sentiment. Lord Veyron, captain of the Night Guard, nodded. The men are behind him. The transition will be seamless. And the rumors? Another council member asked. about dry stand being seen. Madness sees what it wants to see, Seraphine said smoothly. My husband is gone. Whether dead or disappeared into whatever delusion consumed him, the result is the same. We must look forward. Drystan watched her reorganize his kingdom like furniture, her control absolute. She'd been planning this for years, he realized. Every smile, every touch, every moment of tenderness had been rehearsal for this performance of necessary grief. Melis touched his arm, pulling him back to their purpose. They had wardstones to position, magic to wake, truth to weaponize before ceremony made lies permanent. They worked through the night, Melis following Saren's instructions with increasing confidence. Each wardstone was placed in hidden corners, beneath ritual platforms, inside the very walls of the Covenant chamber that had been forgotten but never truly sealed. The magic recognized Melis's bloodline, accepting her touch as it would have rejected anyone else. At dawn, Drystan stood in the shadows above the great hall, watching nobility gather. His nobility, people he'd protected, enriched, elevated. Not one of them questioned the narrative of his madness. Not one demanded proof. They wanted a comfortable story. They always had. Below, Alaric entered in processional, looking every inch the reluctant hero. Seraphine walked beside him, playing the supportive sister by marriage. The crowd applauded. Trumpets sounded. The performance of legitimacy was flawless. Melis appeared beside Drystan, her hands still glowing faintly from the ward she'd positioned. It's ready, she whispered. When you give the word, every word is released. Every truth speaks. Drystan looked at her, this woman whose bloodline should have stood beside his from the beginning, whose ancestors had been erased to make room for noble ambition. If this fails. It won't, Melis said with the certainty of someone who'd survived by being invisible long enough to see everything. They built their lies on silence. We're about to make the stones themselves scream. Below, the ceremony began. Alaric knelt. The crown was lifted, and Drystan stepped from the shadows, no longer king but something more dangerous, a truth that refused to stay buried. The trap was set. Now, it only needs to spring. Okay, stop. We are literally seconds away from the most epic confrontation in this entire story. Drystan is about to walk into his own coronation ceremony, the ceremony meant for his brother, and expose everyone. If you're not subscribed yet, click that button right now because you're about to witness something incredible. Also, quick poll in the comments. Do you think Alaric deserves redemption, or should he face the same fate as Seraphine? Drop your answer, because we're about to find out exactly what happens when truth becomes a weapon. Here we go. Drystan stepped into the light as the crown touched Alaric's head. The great hall fell silent with the sudden totality of held breath. 1,000 faces turned toward the balcony where he stood, pale, weakened, stripped of every symbol of authority except the blood in his veins and the truth on his lips. Stop, he said. His voice cracked, but it carried. Alaric jerked upright, the crown sliding askew. Seraphine's mask of composure fractured for a single, beautiful instant, shock and fury flashing across her features before control reasserted itself. Drystan, she breathed, and somehow made his name sound like grief and concern. Thank the stars. We thought. You've been so unwell, my love.
Come down.
Let us help you. Her performance was flawless. Half the hall took a step toward him with worry etched on their faces, ready to rescue their mad king from himself. Now, Drystan said quietly. Melis, hidden in the servants' gallery, pressed her palms together in the final gesture Saren had taught her. The wards released. The sound was like breaking glass stretched across eternity. Every wardstone Saren had hidden throughout the palace for 3 centuries activated simultaneously. The air itself seemed to crack. And then, impossibly, the stones began to speak. Valar's voice, preserved in magic, echoing from the walls themselves, filled the great hall with words that had been buried for generations. I, Valar Ravenholt, bind my bloodline to covenant. Let no heir rule who forgets the servants are partners, not property. Let no crown pass to those who see power as dominion rather than duty. Let the old families stand beside the throne, not beneath it, or let the throne crumble to dust. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, but it was the servants lining the walls who went rigid with recognition, hearing their history spoken aloud for the first time in their lives. Ancient propaganda, Seraphine said smoothly, already spinning. Everyone knows Valar's mind was failing at the end. These wards are. The floor of the Covenant chamber beneath them split open. Not collapse, but revelation. The sealed chamber tore itself open like a wound exposing infection, and from it rose pillars of stone covered in 3 centuries of testimony. Names, dates, bloodlines. The true genealogy of power written in script that glowed with undeniable magic. And there, preserved in crystal, vials of poison. Dozens of them, labeled in Seraphine's own hand. Ravenholt's end.
Dose monthly.
Duration, 3 years. 3 years, Drystan said, his voice stronger now. She's been killing me for 3 years.
Slowly, carefully.
Calibrated to look like natural decline. Lies, Seraphine hissed, but her eyes had gone cold and calculating. She was already adapting, searching for the angle that would save her. Alaric stood frozen on the dais, the crown still askew on his head. I didn't. We weren't supposed to, Drystan, I swear. I didn't know it was 3 years. She said you were suffering, that it was mercy. Shut up, Seraphine snapped. But Alaric was unraveling, the weight of complicity finally breaking through ambition's anesthesia. She said you wanted to step down, that you were too proud to admit weakness. I thought we were helping you find peace, not. The blood oath tablets exploded. Every oath sworn to Dristan's line, every pledge written in the true Covenant's language, cracked open simultaneously. The false oaths Alaric had orchestrated shattered like glass, and beneath them, the original bindings blazed to life. Words written in Valar's own blood, still binding, still true. The night guards stumbled as the magic seized them. Oaths they'd sworn 3 weeks ago evaporated, and older oaths, deeper oaths, bound to Ravenholt blood and Covenant service, surged back into their bones. Captain Veron dropped to his knees, crying out as loyalty realigned itself inside his chest. The king, Veron gasped, his sword falling from nerveless fingers. By the Covenant, the true king still lives. Half the guard followed him down, compelled by magic older than their treachery. And then Saren appeared. She materialized on the dais like memory made flesh, her body translucent and failing but her voice strong. I am Saren Finch, keeper of the Covenant, witness to Valar's true testament. I have waited 300 years to speak before this court. Impossible, Lord Merrick breathed. She should be
dead.
Saren smiled. I am. But magic holds me here long enough to testify. Seraphine's bloodline was forbidden from the throne. The marriage to Drystan broke the Covenant. The poison in his veins is not just murder. It's the final severing of everything Valar built to prevent exactly this kind of corruption. Seraphine moved with the speed of desperate violence. Her hand flashed to her bodice, pulling a blade hidden in mourning silk, not ceremonial, but wickedly sharp and already darkened with something that smoked in the air. She lunged not at Drystan, but at Saren's fading form, as if destroying the witness could unmake the testimony. Drystan intercepted her, not with royal authority or immortal strength, but with the desperate resolve of a survivor who'd already lost everything except the truth. They collided on the dais in a tangle of blades and bodies. Drystan felt the poisoned edge slice across his arm, fresh toxin mixing with old, but his hands found her wrist and held. No, he said through gritted teeth. Not again. Never again. Seraphine's mask shattered completely. The perfect queen dissolved into something feral and furious. You were supposed to die quietly, she snarled. Fade away like all weak things do. Instead, you've ruined everything. She twisted, revealing the rings on her other hand, each one hollow, each one filled with venom. She'd been wearing weapons all along, her beauty the sheath for calculated murder. Maelys appeared beside them, moving with the confidence of someone who'd spent years invisible and was done hiding. She caught Seraphine's other wrist before the rings could connect with Dristan's throat. "He's not alone anymore," Maelys said. "And neither are we." The servants stepped forward, not attacking but witnessing, creating a wall of bodies around the dais. Every person who'd been told they were invisible finally chose to be seen. Their presence was damning in its silence, more powerful than any accusation. Seraphine thrashed, but Drystan held on even as his strength failed. Captain Veron and two other guards finally moved to restrain her, their faces twisted with shame and reborn loyalty. "Check her chambers," Saren said, her form growing more translucent. "The contracts are hidden in the false bottom of her jewelry case. Agreements with the southern territories. Plans to dissolve the covenant completely once Drystan was gone. She wasn't just killing a king, she was ending an entire philosophy of rule." Guards rushed from the hall. Nobles whispered in horror or calculation. And Alaric stood at the center of it all, the crown in his hands now, staring at it like he'd never seen it before. "I didn't know," he said again, but this time it sounded like begging. "Drystan, I swear on our father's memory. She told me you were dying anyway, that the poison was mercy, that we were just hastening the inevitable. I never wanted, I never meant." "You meant enough to let it happen," Drystan said, pulling away from Seraphine's subdued form. His arm burned where her blade had cut him. Fresh poison mixed with old, but he was still standing, still breathing. "You wanted the crown. You just wanted to believe you were innocent of the cost." Alaric crumpled. Not physically, but internally, the collapse of a man confronting exactly who he'd been willing to become. The contracts were found. Every damning word written in Seraphine's hand. Treaties that would have dissolved servant rights, sold covenant lands, transformed partnership into pure exploitation. Plans spanning decades, meticulous and monstrous. Seraphine laughed as they read the charges. "You think you've won?" she said, blood from her split lips staining her perfect teeth. "You've exposed a conspiracy. So what? The nobles will forgive anything for stability. The servants will go back to invisibility, because that's what they know. And you," she looked at Drystan with something like pity, "you're still dying. The poison's still in your blood. I just won't have the pleasure of watching." Saren's fading hand touched Dristan's shoulder. "The poison can be purged," she whispered. "Now that you know what it is. Now that you choose differently." Her form was almost gone. "The covenant is broken, Drystan. But it can be remade, if you have the courage to actually change how power works." She dissolved into light, her 300 years of vigil finally complete. The crown lay on the dais between Drystan and Alaric. Guards flanked Seraphine, stripping the venom rings from her fingers. The court watched in stunned silence. Captain Veron stepped forward, tears of shame on his weathered face. He lifted the crown, held it out to Drystan. "Your Majesty," he said, voice breaking, "forgive us. We were blind, but we see now. Please take what was always yours." Drystan looked at the crown, then at Maelys, standing beside him covered in dust and defiant courage. At the servants witnessing from the walls. At Alaric, broken by the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Victory, he realized, wasn't triumph. It was standing in the rubble of everything you'd believed and choosing what to build from the wreckage. He reached for the crown.
And stopped.
Dristan's hand hovered above the crown, and the entire great hall held its breath. Then he lowered his hand. "No," he said quietly. The word rippled through the assembly like a stone dropped in still water. Captain Veron's face crumpled in confusion. The nobles exchanged uncertain glances. Even Maelys looked at him with something between concern and surprise. "Your Majesty?" Veron's voice trembled. "I don't understand. The crown is yours by right.
By blood.
By a covenant I never honored," Drystan interrupted. His voice was weak from poison and exhaustion, but it carried the weight of someone who'd finally learned to see. By promises I broke through ignorance and arrogance. By a system I perpetuated because it benefited me to remain blind. He turned to face the full assembly. Nobles in their finery, servants in their shadows, guards caught between shame and restored oaths. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to stand. I was poisoned for 3 years, he said, letting the words land without embellishment. 3 years of slow murder happening at my own table, in my own bed, during rituals meant to honor the very covenant I was violating.
And I didn't see it.
Not because it was hidden, but because I chose not to see. Lord Merrick cleared his throat. Your Majesty, you were betrayed by those closest to you. No one could have. Everyone could have. Drystan cut him off. Maid saw. The servants knew something was wrong. Even Alaric. He glanced at his brother, still clutching the crown like a weapon he no longer wanted. Even my brother had enough doubt to hesitate. I was the only one who refused to question because questioning would have required me to admit my throne was built on corrupted foundations. He gestured to the wardstones still glowing around the hall, Valor's true covenant written in light that couldn't be denied. My ancestor made a promise. Partnership, not dominion. Service exchanged for service. Power tethered to the people it governed. And every generation since has systematically dismantled that promise while pretending to uphold it. Ancient history, Lady Corvine ventured carefully. Surely we can't be held accountable for. We are accountable, Drystan said, his voice hardening. Every choice to prioritize noble alliances over covenant obligations. Every servant was treated as invisible. Every warning was dismissed because it came from someone without a title. I am accountable. This court is accountable. And I will not take that crown until I can swear I understand what it actually means. He turned to Maid, who stood watching him with eyes that had seen centuries of history through the lens of erasure. Maid's crown saved my life, he said, loud enough for every ear in the hall. Not because she owed me loyalty, I never earned that. Not because her bloodline swore oaths, we broke those. She saved me because she possessed the moral clarity I lacked. Because she knew truth matters more than comfort. Maid's expression flickered between pride and discomfort at being seen so publicly, so completely. Without her, Drystan continued, I would have died in ignorance, and this court would have applauded my brother's ascension while my murder went unquestioned. She is the reason any of you are hearing the truth right now. And her bloodline. He gestured to the wardstones. Her bloodline was supposed to stand beside mine from the beginning. As equals. As partners. Not as servants, but as the conscience of this throne has been lacking for generations. The servants along the walls stirred. Some with recognition, others with the dangerous bloom of hope that comes from finally being acknowledged. Drystan forced himself to look at the nobles. I married Seraphine because it consolidated power. Because it brought the southern territories under unified rule. Because every advisor told me it was politically brilliant. His voice cracked. No one mentioned it violated the founding covenant. Or perhaps someone did, and I chose not to hear because convenience sounded better than obligation. Lord Merrick's face had gone pale. Several other council members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own complicity in the mirror Drystan was holding up. Saren Finch waited 300 years to speak the truth, Drystan said, looking at the spot where her spirit had faded. She died this morning, having spent centuries in magical suspension, protecting testimony that everyone in power wanted buried. She gave everything to preserve a promise I inherited and ignored. He turned finally to Alaric, who looked smaller than Drystan had ever seen him, a young man collapsing under the weight of choices that had seemed justified when cloaked in Seraphine's smooth certainty. My brother, Drystan said, and the word carried both grief and condemnation. You wanted the crown. That's not a crime. But you were willing to obtain it through poison and lies rather than challenge or honest ambition. You told yourself it was mercy, that I was dying anyway, that you were simply helping nature along. Alaric's knees buckled. He sank to the dais, the crown tumbling from his hands to ring against stone. I'm sorry, Alaric whispered. I'm so sorry. I don't know who I became. Someone who chose comfort over courage, Drystan said. Not cruelly, but with the exhausted honesty of someone beyond performance. Someone who lets another person do terrible work while keeping your hands clean enough to sleep at night. Until you couldn't anymore. He looked at Captain Veron. Alaric will be exiled. Not executed. He's still my brother, and I won't begin a new era with family blood on my hands. But he cannot remain in this kingdom. His name, his titles, his claim, all of it ends here. Alaric sobbed openly, but didn't protest. Perhaps exile felt like mercy compared to living with what he'd enabled. And Seraphine? Lady Corvine asked carefully. Dristan's expression hardened. Strip her immortality. The ritual can be done. I've read the forbidden texts. Let her live out a mortal span and imprisonment, experiencing the aging and decay she tried to inflict on me. Let her feel time as a weapon instead of a gift. Seraphine's laughter rang out, brittle and defiant. You think that's justice? Making me mortal? I've accomplished more in 1 century than you have in 4. Even mortal, I'll outlive your legacy. Perhaps, Drystan said. But you'll do it behind walls, watching the kingdom you tried to corrupt choose a different path. That's a worse fate than death for someone like you, watching power continue without you. Guards led her away, still laughing, but the sound was hollow. The great hall fell into heavy silence. The crown lay on the stone dais, glinting in the light from the wardstones. No one moved to pick it up. Drystan turned back to Captain Veron. I will rule again, he said. But not yet. Not until I've walked every servant corridor in this palace. Not until I've learned the names of the people who kept this kingdom running while I looked past them. Not until I understand what Valor's covenant actually demanded, not just what we pretended it meant. The kingdom needs leadership, Lord Merrick protested weakly. The kingdom needs something better than what I've been providing, Drystan countered. Form a temporary council. Include servant voices, actual votes, not token presence. Use Valor's wardstones as a guide. I'll take the crown when I can swear I've earned the right to wear it, not just inherited the privilege. He picked up the crown finally, but didn't place it on his head. Instead, he set it on a pedestal of stone at the center of the dais, visible, present, but unclaimed. Let it sit there, he said, as a reminder that power isn't owed to anyone. It's a responsibility that must be proven worthy of bearing. When I take it again, if I take it again, it will be because I've demonstrated I understand the difference between ruling and serving. Melis stepped beside him, and for the first time in 4 centuries, a crown stood next to a Ravenholt on the palace dais as an equal rather than a servant. The poison is still killing me, Drystan said, his voice dropping. Saren said it could be purged, but I don't know if there's time. I may not live long enough to reclaim that crown. But if I die, let it be as someone who finally saw clearly. Someone who acknowledged the people who saved him instead of the power that failed him. The council members looked at each other, uncertain, shaken. The old order had been exposed and condemned. The new order had no shape yet. But the crown sat between them, not on anyone's head, not in anyone's hands. A question waiting for an answer that would require more than blood and tradition to provide. Power, Drystan understood, wasn't something to be taken or inherited. It was something to be continuously earned, questioned, and held accountable to the people it claimed to serve. The crown would wait, and so would he, until he proved worthy of wearing it again. Dawn broke over the palace courtyard 3 months after the false coronation collapsed into truth. Drystan stood at the center of the stone plaza, where he'd once reviewed troops and received foreign dignitaries with all the pageantry of untouchable power. Now he stood alone, watching servants prepare for the morning market that he'd authorized to be held within the palace walls, common merchants selling to nobles and servants alike, the barriers between them made permeable for the first time in generations. The poison was leaving his body slowly, painfully. Healers who understood covenant magic, pulled from the old families who'd preserved the knowledge in secret, worked daily to purge the toxins Seraphine had woven into his blood. Some days he could barely stand. Other days, like this one, he felt almost whole. "Your Majesty." Captain Veron approached, his armor no longer polished to ceremonial perfection, but marked with the practical wear of someone who'd returned to actual service. "The delegation from Hallowground Lane has arrived." Drystan nodded. Today they would seal the house where Saren had waited for 3 centuries, not to erase it but to memorialize it. A monument to truth that power had tried to bury, and to the woman who'd refused to let it stay buried. The delegation consisted of servants and common folk who'd lived near the lane their entire lives, avoiding it without understanding why. Now they came to witness its transformation from haunted ruin to sacred memory. Maid stood among them, no longer wearing servant gray, but the deep green of the Crown family line, colors that hadn't been displayed openly in 200 years. She caught Dristan's eye and offered a small nod. They'd spent weeks in those halls together, learning from Saren before her spirit finally released its grip on the world. "She's at peace now," Maid had said the morning Saren's presence faded completely from the wardstones. "The covenant is spoken again. She can rest." They walked to Hallowground Lane together, the entire council and a crowd of witnesses following. The house stood as it had for centuries, decaying, wrapped in vines that wrote their own history on crumbling walls. But now the wards glowed openly, visible to anyone who cared to look. Valer's words were carved into new stone markers placed along the lane. "Let no heir rule who forgets the servants are partners, not property." Drystan placed his hand on the door, feeling the ancient magic recognize his bloodline. "This place will not be destroyed or forgotten," he said, his voice carrying to the assembled witnesses. "It will stand as a reminder of what happens when power refuses to see the truth. When convenience becomes more important than covenant. Let every ruler who comes after me walk this lane, and remember, Saren Finch waited 300 years for someone to listen. May we never again make the truth wait so long." They sealed the house with new wards, not to hide it, but to preserve it. The lane would remain accessible, a pilgrimage site for those who needed to remember that power must always be held accountable to something larger than itself. As they returned to the palace, Drystan didn't take the main entrance. Instead, he turned toward the servant passages, gesturing for the council to follow. Some of them hesitated, and used to these narrow corridors, uncomfortable with the way the architecture forced them to move single file through spaces designed for invisibility. "These halls sustained the palace while we held ceremonies above them," Drystan said, trailing his fingers along walls marked with generations of servant symbols. "People moved through here carrying everything that made our comfort possible. And we never learned their names." He stopped at a common room where servants took their meals, a space far less grand than the noble dining hall, but warm and functional. A woman named Jessa, who'd worked in the kitchens for 40 years, looked up in shock as the king entered her space. "Your Majesty," she breathed, starting to rise. "Please sit," Drystan said and meant it. "I came to eat if you'll permit it. I've been told the bread here is better than what reaches the upper tables." The servants exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't protocol. Kings didn't eat in servant halls. But Maid moved past Drystan and took a seat at the long wooden table, and slowly, carefully, the others made space. They ate together in awkward silence at first, generations of separation not easily bridged by a single meal. But Drystan asked questions about their work, their families, the difficulties they faced that never reached council discussions. He listened. Really listened, and slowly, tentatively, they began to speak. He learned that the northern wing leaked every winter, that servants had been patching it themselves for a decade while repair requests went ignored. He learned about a steward who'd been skimming supplies, and about a guard who'd been protecting servant children from noble sons who saw them as entertainment rather than people. Why didn't anyone report this? Lord Merrick asked, horrified. An older servant named Corwin met his eyes. To whom, my lord? Who listens when we speak? The question hung in the air like an indictment. I'm listening now, Drystan said quietly. And I'll keep listening. But that only matters if it leads to change. Words without action are just more comfortable lies. He established new protocols that day, monthly councils that included elected servant representatives, open audiences where anyone could bring grievances directly to the throne, mandatory rotations where nobles spent time understanding the work that sustained their comfort. The nobles resisted. Of course they did. Change always met resistance from those who benefited from existing structures. But Drystan had learned something during his weeks in hiding. Power maintained through willful blindness eventually collapses. The only question was whether it collapsed into something better or something worse. 6 months after the false coronation, Drystan walked the palace at dawn and finally felt like he recognized it. Not because the architecture had changed, but because he was seeing it completely for the first time. The servants carrying water, the guards changing shifts, the early merchants setting up stalls, all the invisible labor that made sovereignty possible. Melis found him in the Covenant Chamber, now restored and opened to regular use. The wardstones had been arranged in a circle around the central dais, their testimony preserved and honored rather than buried. The council wants to know when you'll reclaim the crown, she said. Drystan looked at the pedestal where it still rested, untouched since the day he'd refused it. 6 months of watching, learning, changing. 6 months of proving he understood the difference between inheriting power and earning the right to wield it. Today, he said, if you'll stand beside me. Melis's eyes widened. Your Majesty, I can't. The covenant required Ravenholt's blood to marry into servant lines, Drystan said, to keep power tethered to the people it governed. I'm not asking you to marry me, Melis. I'm asking you to serve as my covenant advisor, to stand where your bloodline should have stood from the beginning, as an equal voice in governance, not as a servant, but as a partner. The nobles will never accept. Then they'll learn, Drystan interrupted gently. The same way I'm learning, through discomfort and necessity and the understanding that old ways led us to poison and betrayal. We're building something different. It won't be perfect, but it will be honest. They returned to the great hall together. The council assembled, nobles still uncertain in their newly questioned authority, servants still adjusting to having voices that mattered. The crown waited on its stone pedestal, patient as truth. Drystan lifted it finally, feeling its weight. Not just the metal, but everything it represented. Obligation, responsibility, the accumulated failures and small successes of everyone who'd worn it before him. I take this crown, he said, not because it's mine by blood, but because I've spent 6 months learning what it actually demands. I take it knowing I'll fail, knowing I'll make mistakes. But I take it with eyes open to those failures, with the understanding that power must constantly prove itself worthy. He placed it on his head, and it felt heavier than he remembered. Good. It should be heavy. Melis stood beside him on the dais, not behind, not kneeling, but at his shoulder where covenant partners had always been meant to stand. The nobles looked uncertain. The servants looked cautiously hopeful. We're rebuilding, Drystan said. Not restoring what was, but creating what should have been. It will be uncomfortable. It will challenge every assumption about how power works. But it begins here, with a king who learned to see only when he lost everything that let him remain blind. The council didn't applaud. This wasn't a moment for celebration, but for sober commitment to something difficult and necessary. As the assembly dispersed, Drystan remained on the dais with Melis. Through the high windows, he could see the city spreading beyond the palace walls, his kingdom, his responsibility, his covenant to honor rather than exploit. Do you think Valar would approve? Melis asked quietly. I think Valar would say we have a long way to go, Drystan replied. But at least we're finally walking in the right direction. The crown sat heavier on his head than it ever had before. But his vision was clearer. His purpose is sharper. He was king again, Not because he'd reclaimed power, but because he'd learned what power actually meant. Not dominion. Not comfort. Not the privilege of remaining blind. Service. Accountability. The courage to see everything, even when sight revealed his own failures. The king had come home. Not to the throne he'd left, but to one rebuilt with open eyes and honest hands. And for the first time in 4 centuries of Ravenholt rule, the crown served the covenant instead of devouring it. And that's how a king learned that true power isn't about wearing a crown, it's about being worthy of it. If this story moved you, if Dristan's journey from blind sovereign to awakened leader resonated with you, hit that like button right now. But more importantly, I want to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done differently if you were in Dristan's position? Would you have trusted Maelys from the start? Would you have forgiven Alaric? This story proves that sometimes losing everything is the only way to see what truly matters. And speaking of seeing clearly, I've got another incredible story coming tomorrow that's going to blow your mind. It involves secrets, impossible choices, and a twist you will not see coming. So if you haven't subscribed yet, click that button now because you don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for staying with me through Dristan's journey. Drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from, and I'll see you tomorrow with another story that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. Until then, remember, real power isn't taken, it's earned. See you soon, story family.